Do you think, I want to like widen the lens with you for broader thoughts about a long-term strategy for, I guess, for, just say more broadly, like a progressive politics in America. Do you think that on the flip side, I mean, the squad, which I guess we're calling them now, I kind of resist that, to be honest, but it's the four cool members of Congress. They have been pretty unafraid and pretty
We found four.
The what four?
Yeah. I said we found four. We found four cool ones.
Right, exactly. What do you make of their willingness to acknowledge the reality that there is actually a war inside the Democratic Party?
I think the way that those women have operated has been brilliant. And I think they are some of the only ones in the Democratic Party who actually understand the moment that we are living through from a cultural, political, and certainly media perspective. And part of that currency is that, they don't hide it when they're unhappy. They don't owe anything to the Democratic establishment, so they're not afraid to take them on, right? They have their own power bases. And just look at, did you see this poll that just came out? I think it was Marist poll, Marist, NPR, TBS, I can't remember. But they polled like 20 different issues for their popularity. And Green New Deal, a concept that a year ago no one could have told you what it was, is now one of the most popular policy ideas in the country. And a lot of that credit, of course, the credit belongs to the movement activists who have been pushing this idea and crafting it and getting it ready for prime time. But in terms of pushing it into public consciousness and awareness, AOC has been incredible. And so when I see all this hand-wringing about, oh, my God, like she's taking the Democratic Party off the cliff and it's a disaster and et cetera, like, what are you talking about? Finally, we have someone who actually knows how to do combat, who's actually exciting people, and who, by the way, has put forward what we've been wringing our hands about. Oh, the Democratic Party has no vision for the future, and we need an overarching framework that people can understand. And here AOC has presented one to the American public, and they're like, yeah, we're down with that. We're into it. And now all the presidential candidates are embracing at least parts of it and rushing to get their climate plans out and be right on the issue. How can you argue with the effectiveness of their strategy at this point?
Do you think what makes that sort of utter like cowardice with these people? Because, one part I think of understanding the conflict in the Democratic Party is absolutely like who is aligned with capital and who isn't aligned with capital, and what people's ideological commitments are to some extent, and the fact that we could tell a longer story, right? That like, the sort of broader collapse of labor unions, the rise of totally unregulated capital, how that affects center-left parties, right? Like, there's this really important historical contextual understanding, which I'd love you to comment on too. But there's also like, I can think of politicians who I really don't like. I have totally different politics from. Bill Clinton in some ways, or a Tony Blair in some ways, right? Who weren't just like constitutionally and temperamentally wussbags. And so it's like, when I look at the Democratic leadership, it's like, look, I understand. Of course, we're going to be in the opposite side of Chuck Schumer. He's a Wall Street handmaiden. But that doesn't, like, Harry Reid and I have very different politics, but I think Harry Reid understood, like, fuck Republicans and let's get at it. What is it with this leadership class?
Yeah, well, I think that Democrats writ large have this sort of lingering PTSD, and you can see that it's a bit of a generational issue, right? Mm-hmm. But much of the leadership and the over 50 certainly members of the Democratic Party still have this belief that no amount of data could shake them from, that the country is really center-right. And this is Ryan Grimm really makes this case much more profoundly and powerfully than I could. But basically, that the country is center-right, and so we have to, not really tell the voters what we really want. We've always got to hedge. We've always got to come back further to the quote-unquote center than we want to. We've got to work with the Republicans if we're going to hold power. And it's all just in the service of, this is what we've got to do to be able to win elections. And that was Hillary Clinton, right? She said, I'm a pragmatic progressive. That's the way they see it. In my heart, I'm right there with you, but I'm the one who gets the way that we have to win. Of course, that ignores the fact that, let's put Hillary Clinton aside. In the 8 years before that, while we had a Democratic president, we lost close to 1,000 state legislative seats, governor's mansions, we lost the House, we lost the Senate, and of course then we lost the presidency. So while we were so fixated on the compromises we had to make to win elections, we just kept losing elections. But I think that PTSD of being in the wilderness and then the way that Bill Clinton, I'm not even going to say the way that he ran, because the way he actually ran his first campaign was rather populist.
Right.
But the way that he governed, that has been so embedded in the mindset of this set of Democrats that there's no getting out of it, I think. And no facts or data could possibly shake them from this sort of foundational view. And then you also get into the psychology of where does your power base come from, and what's the system that you were able to thrive in, right? What got you to your leadership position? And if it's a legacy system, then of course you're going to be invested in maintaining that legacy system.
What do you think are if you were designing the blueprint for not only winning, doing something really important? I obviously think getting Sanders elected is incredibly important. But I think another thing that the right does is that, later on in the show, we're going to talking with a brilliant movement organizer on tactics. And the last time he was on, we talked about strategy, right? And sometimes when you look at the political parties, the right is amazing at strategy and tactics, and the Democrats and liberals are sometimes good at tactics. So, what would be a plan?
Fair.
As someone who really understands this stuff, and I think has this deep understanding of a lot of different dynamics, both inside and outside, right? What do you think the kind of blueprint is if you were going to have a plan or a play for us moving forward to acquire and maybe actually start to sustain power?
Well, I listened to some of your, what you were talking about earlier with Greece in particular, and you talked a little bit about kind of the theory of political change, right, that you have to embrace in order to really be successful as a leftist movement. And I think you have to put that at the center even more than the particular policies. What matters to me is that theory of political change. So if you are going to operate within the current system, given the current structure of who has influence and how much the money matters and all the way things that work in Washington and across the country, really, and having to go to the Republicans with your hat in hand when they have no interest in giving you a win ever. If you're going to work within that system, you're going to fail, period, end of story. And people know that, right? So that reality ties into the electoral reality, that if you're offering people I'm going to work with the Republicans, they're like, no, you're not. You may try, but that's just not going to work, right? So you have to first and foremost offer people a vision for the future that they actually think, actually believe is going to make a difference in their lives. Now, that's a fucking hard thing to do, right? And that's why I don't know that I'm going to give you the full blueprint today, but I'll tell you a little bit of why I think that leftist populist movements around the globe have had more trouble than the right-wing, quote-unquote, populist movements. It's because if you pin a lot of your ideology around basically some sort of racial supremacy, that's very easy to deliver on without passing a single bill. right? You get a sort of psychological welfare just from the president telling these congresswomen to go back where they came from, right?
Yep.
That's a psychological benefit to, people who are looking to be put back in the place where they think that they deserve and belong. Right. On the left, you have to actually deliver the goods, right? And so if you aren't talking about a theory of political change that is big enough for people to believe that you're really going to make a difference in their lives that they're going to be able to see, they're just going to think you're full of it like every other politician. And so, again, I don't think that's a blueprint, but I think that's where you have to start from. And if you aren't, if you aren't fundamentally changing some of the dynamics and the incentives that operate in our system and making structural change, then I don't think you get past the starting gates with a lot of people.
Yeah, I think that that's really true. And that's another reason I just want to say, one of the reasons that I'm such a strong advocate for Lula, and I've covered him so much, I think actually you just framed, in addition to the fact that he absolutely is, in my opinion, a political prisoner and an incredibly successful president, I actually think he did that. One, look, delivered tens of millions of people out of poverty. But two, I think that he actually did communicate this incredibly effective, no, this way of doing things is better, right? This is make Brazil happy again, right? A society where prosperity is growing, where you're enjoying your life and more people are being taken care of, and you don't have to divide yourself into some pathetic little sort of racial hierarchy. And in fact, we're going to challenge that, but in this very broad-based, visceral way. Again, the dude would have beat Bolsonaro. I think that that is something to the synthesis. And I think you're also right about the inbuilt advantage of, Trump and all these guys are total 1% people, but they can dispense with the racism and the xenophobia, and that charges up their base, and that costs nothing. You're totally right.
It's sheer joy. You look at that rally crowd chanting "Send her back." That's what they came. They're so happy in that moment to be able to assert their dominance. And look, I'm not one that believes everyone is racist or everyone that supported Trump is racist. I grew up in rural America. I live in rural America. I lived in Kentucky during the 2016 election. I actually love these people. But you can't deny that white supremacy at its core is essentially an economic message, right? It's right. Okay, well, these people screwed you over. We're going to give it back to you, right? And to our great shame, the Democrats were not able to offer anything that was superior to that incredibly shitty, not to mention immoral economic message.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, what was the response? Was and now Beyonce.
Yeah.
No economic plan, but we have Pharrell.
Well, and it was oh, what's our economic plan? Let me do a battery of polls and I'll get back to you on that. Because it's certainly not going to be what I said 2 years ago or 4 years ago. Got to figure this out on the fly. And that's the other thing. We were, again, digging into this poll that had all the issue questions, and Green New Deal polled very well, and there's some sort of contradictory information on healthcare and Medicare for all, and some of the immigration positions that, on decriminalizing undocumented immigration, those things polled very poorly. And so we were talking about that on the show, and what I said is, look, we've tried the poll-tested route. People are much less interested in, do I align with you on every issue than do I believe in you and do I think that you're full of shit? So one of the things that Trump did that worked very effectively is he said a bunch of things that no one would ever tell you to say, right? They were terrible things to say. Everyone said, don't say these things. And he said them anyway. And that made people believe, wrongly, obviously, but believe that he was really saying what he thought. So I think people overestimate how much your specific positioning on an ideological spectrum matters, and dramatically underestimate how much they believe that you're really going to deliver for them on the core things that they've sort of signed up for, which is why you see like Biden and Bernie, right, leading in the polls and have very similar demographics that they appeal to. If you ask Biden voters who their second choice is, they say Bernie, and vice versa, even though they're obviously at opposite ends of the ideological spectrum. But there's more going on there than just where the political positioning falls.
I completely agree with you. And actually, just to loop back before we go, that's another reason why your point about Bernie going into the lion's den is so important. When he does things like tell Cap not to fuck with him, which again, it's such a narrow story that most people would have no idea what you're talking about or care, nor should they. But the general sentiment of, you know what, that is a tangible example now of what he will do in 20 months when he's in the president and everything's coming at him and he's saying, no, I'm getting everybody health care, and no, I'm canceling debt, and so on and so on. It's the showing. And I think that actually overlaps exactly with your super shrewd advice about going on mainstream outlets.
Well, and one last thought on that is, Bernie Sanders is a different kind of figure, right? And so I think some people also have a hard time wrapping their head around imagining him as president. So I think some more like international travel, right? Some settings where you can see him playing that role on the world stage. I think that also could be a benefit to the campaign.
Totally. That's such a good call. Krystal Ball is the co-host of Rising. It's on the Hill TV. It's great. It's the morning show you're going to watch. When you see it, you will see, I don't know, if you're like a tech person, you'll block Morning Joe from ever showing up on your feed. But you should have anyways.
It's a great show when you're on, Michael.
It's always my pleasure. Anytime you want, I have a great time coming on the show, and I hope that you will come back to TMBS again soon.
Happy to do it anytime.
All right.
Have a good one, Michael. Great to chat with you guys.
Too. Thanks so much. You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.